September 14th, 1988. 31,000 feet above the East German plains, near the Fulda Gap. The sun was low and blinding, a white glare slicing across the canopy of an F-16C as Captain Daniel "Hawk" Mercer steadied his breathing. The jet trembled faintly beneath him, not from turbulence, but from restrained power, an engine waiting to be unleashed. Below, the Cold War's most dangerous fault line stretched from horizon to horizon. Concrete runways, camouflaged hangars, and armored divisions hidden under trees. This was where World War III was expected to begin. Today, it began with radar contacts. "Bandits, 2 contacts, closing head-on," came the calm voice of Hawk's wingman, Lieutenant Chris "Solo" Ramirez. Mercer's eyes flicked to the scope. 2 returns. Fast, clean, purposeful. MiG-29s. Even inside the cockpit, Mercer felt the weight of their reputation. The Fulcrum, the pride of the Soviet air defense system, designed to kill NATO fighters in close combat, designed to dominate the merge, designed by men who believed air combat was won by aggression, strength, and turning harder than the enemy. On the ground, at an observation complex near Magdeburg, Colonel Viktor Sokolov adjusted his headset. Gray-haired, thick-necked, and decorated, he was a veteran of decades of Soviet aviation doctrine. He had not flown a combat sortie in years, but his confidence had not faded. "The MiG-29 is superior in the visual fight," he told the East German officers beside him. "Once they merge, the American will be trapped." The exercise rules were simple. No long-range missiles, no ambush shots, visual range combat only. A test of pilots, machines, and doctrine. At 31,000 feet, the distance vanished in seconds. "Merge!" The sky snapped apart. The first MiG-29 crossed left to right, close enough that Mercer could see the red star flash across its fuselage. The second Fulcrum pitched up aggressively, engines roaring, trying to seize the vertical. Soviet-trained pilots wasted no time. They went straight to what they knew best: tight turns, brute force, overwhelming angles. Mercer felt the instinctive urge to pull harder, to match them turn for turn. He didn't. Instead, he eased off the stick. The G's fell away. The jet's fly-by-wire system translated the smallest input into perfect control, and the engine responded instantly. Speed built, energy accumulated. In the Soviet control room, a radar technician hesitated. One American contact was slipping wide. "He's extending," the technician said. Sokolov frowned. "Is he running?" No, Mercer wasn't running. He was waiting. The MiG-29s, committed to their high-alpha maneuvers, began to bleed speed. Their noses were still dangerous, their missiles still lethal, but physics was quietly turning against them. Airspeed dropped. Options narrowed. Mercer rolled inverted and pulled up into the vertical. The horizon disappeared. Blue sky swallowed the canopy. At the top of the climb, he let the jet pivot, using gravity like a lever. The first MiG appeared below him, slow and wide, its pilot struggling to recover lost energy. "Tone," Mercer heard in his headset. "Fox 2, simulated." The kill was clean. Down below, one blip vanished from the Soviet display. The room went still. The second Fulcrum pilot reacted instantly, pulling into a climbing spiral, trying to regain dominance with thrust and angle. For a moment it looked dramatic, 2 fighters clawing skyward, contrails twisting together. Mercer refused the spiral. He rolled away again, extending just long enough to force separation. The MiG followed, desperate to keep the fight close. That was the mistake. Mercer reversed sharply, snapping the nose back through the MiG's flight path. The helmet-mounted sight locked. The gun sight settled effortlessly. Guns! Guns! The second MiG was finished. In the control room, Colonel Sokolov removed his headset. "This is not possible," an East German officer said quietly. But the data did not lie. The American F-16 had not outturned the Fulcrums. It had not outclimbed them. It had outthought them. It refused the fight the MiGs wanted and created one they couldn't escape. High above, Mercer leveled his wings and let out a long breath. Sweat ran down his spine. He knew this was only an exercise, but he also knew something had shifted. Across the Iron Curtain, a dangerous certainty had just been shattered.
Sokolov finally spoke. "Run it again." The technicians rewound the engagement. Time compressed, symbols sliding backward until the moment before the merge. The MiG-29 icon surged forward once more, confident, aggressive. On the replay, it was obvious what the Soviet advisors had expected to see. A tight turning fight, nose to nose, missiles fired from extreme angles. That was the Fulcrum's world. That was where it was meant to dominate. Instead, the American F-16 broke every expectation. "Pause," Sokolov ordered. The screen froze at the moment the F-16 unloaded and accelerated. "He should have turned," one advisor muttered. "That is when you press the advantage." Sokolov nodded slowly. "Yes, that is what we would do." And therein lay the problem. The MiG-29 had been designed with a philosophy forged in the 1960s and 70s, wars where engagements were short, chaotic, and brutally close. Soviet doctrine assumed the pilot would be guided by ground control, vectored precisely, and then unleashed at the merge like a hammer. Victory came from aggression, from forcing the enemy into a fight he could not escape. But the American F-16 pilot had escaped by refusing to accept the premise of that fight. Across the border, at a NATO briefing room in West Germany, Captain Mercer stood quietly as analysts replayed the same engagement. Unlike the Soviet observers, there was no surprise in the room, only confirmation. "This is exactly what we trained for," an American major said, tapping the screen. "Energy management. Dictate the fight. Don't get dragged into a phone booth." Mercer said nothing. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt relieved, because he knew how easily it could have gone the other way if he had followed instinct instead of training. Back east, the Soviet advisors began questioning the MiG pilots themselves. The Fulcrum crews were young but proud, their flight suits still damp with sweat. "He ran," one pilot insisted. "He refused combat." "No," Sokolov corrected him sharply. "He chose combat, on his terms." The room fell silent. The advisors dug deeper into the telemetry. The MiG-29's thrust-to-weight ratio was impressive. Its instantaneous turn rate was deadly. But every advantage assumed the pilot stayed slow and close. The American had never allowed that condition to persist. He traded position for energy, again and again. What unsettled the Soviet advisors most was not the aircraft, it was the philosophy behind it. The F-16's cockpit design gave the pilot extraordinary situational awareness. The controls required minimal effort. The avionics worked with the pilot instead of demanding his attention. This was not a machine built to be flown by doctrine. It was built to be flown by judgment. Later that evening, Sokolov sat alone, writing notes for a classified report destined for Moscow. His pen paused as he searched for the right words. Admitting technical inferiority was one thing. Admitting conceptual inferiority was far worse. He wrote anyway. The American pilot demonstrated flexibility inconsistent with our expectations. Their training emphasizes independent decision-making at the tactical level.
This represents a significant challenge. Thousands of kilometers away, Soviet engineers and instructors would read similar reports from other exercises, other encounters. Poland, Hungary, simulated fights where Western aircraft consistently refused the script written for them. And in each case, the conclusion was the same. The West was no longer playing the same game. Back at the airbase, Mercer walked across the tarmac as the sun dipped low. The F-16 sat cooling behind him, panels ticking softly. To him it was just a machine, one he trusted with his life. He didn't know about Colonel Sokolov's report or the uneasy conversations it would spark, but he sensed the shift. The Cold War had always been about numbers, tanks, missiles, divisions. Now something harder to measure had entered the equation: adaptability. And for the first time, Soviet advisors were beginning to understand that this, more than speed or firepower, might decide the next war.
At 000 hours, another round of engagements was scheduled. The weather had shifted overnight. Low clouds rolled in from the west, and a thin haze dulled the horizon, conditions that favored discipline over bravado. In the pilot's ready room, Captain Daniel Mercer sat silently, listening as mission planners laid out the rules. Same constraints, visual range only, different pairings. Across the field, the MiG-29 pilots listened to their own briefing. This time, the tone was sharper. Soviet advisors stood closer, voices firmer. "Do not allow separation," one colonel insisted. "Stay tight, force the turn." The Fulcrum pilots nodded, though some exchanged uncertain glances. They had felt the consequences of that advice yesterday. At 28,000 feet, the fighters met again. This time, the MiGs approached more cautiously, spacing themselves wider, trying to deny the F-16s an easy energy advantage. The sky was muted gray, the sun hidden, distances harder to judge. "Contacts 2 o'clock," Mercer's wingman called. The merge came without spectacle, no dramatic head-on pass, just sudden proximity and violent motion. The MiGs tried something new, one pressing forward, the other hanging back, attempting to bracket the Americans. It was textbook interception geometry, executed cleanly. Mercer reacted instantly. He split his formation. "Solo, go high. I'll drag low." The F-16 separated like scissors opening, forcing the MiGs to choose. For a heartbeat, the Soviet pilots hesitated. That hesitation was fatal. Mercer went low, fast, skimming the cloud tops, using speed to stretch the fight horizontally. Above him, his wingman climbed aggressively, forcing the second MiG to follow. The engagement fractured into 2 separate battles, exactly what the Americans wanted. In the first fight, Mercer felt the MiG closing behind him. He could almost imagine the Fulcrum pilot's frustration as the distance stubbornly refused to collapse. The F-16's engine howled, every knot of speed translating into options. He waited. At the edge of the envelope, when the MiG finally committed to a hard turn, Mercer snapped the nose around, bleeding just enough speed to stay lethal. The gun sight flashed. "Guns!" he called. Another simulated kill. Above, the second fight ended seconds later. Solo had forced the MiG into a vertical chase it couldn't sustain. The Fulcrum stalled briefly, nose high, and that was enough. On the ground, the Soviet advisors no longer spoke. They watched in silence as the results printed out. 2 engagements, 2 more losses. "This is not pilot error," one advisor finally said. Sokolov nodded grimly. "No, this is a system problem." He meant more than the aircraft. He meant everything surrounding it: training, doctrine, assumptions built over decades. The MiG-29 was lethal,
only when the world behaved the way Soviet theory said it should. The Americans had introduced chaos. That afternoon, a closed-door meeting took place. East German officers listened as Soviet advisors debated openly, something that almost never happened. Our pilots are disciplined. Their aircraft is powerful. Power is meaningless without choice, Sokolov replied. The Americans always have a choice. He gestured toward the F-16's flight profile data. Look how often they disengage. They are not afraid to break contact. They do not equate withdrawal with weakness. This cut deep. Soviet doctrine treated disengagement as failure. The idea that leaving a fight could be a path to victory was alien and dangerous. Back on the flight line, Mercer climbed down from his jet and removed his helmet. He saw the MiG pilots across the ramp. There was no hostility in their eyes now, only curiosity. One of them gave a small nod. Mercer returned it. They were professionals. They understood what had happened, even if their institutions struggled to accept it. As night fell, reports were transmitted eastward. Not just raw numbers, but uncomfortable observations. The West's fighters were not merely machines. They were extensions of a philosophy that trusted the individual in combat. And that philosophy was proving difficult to counter.
In his briefcase lay a report marked Совершенно секретно, top secret. Inside the Soviet Air Force headquarters, the corridors were quiet, voices lowered. Portraits of past marshals watched silently as Sokolov was ushered into a conference room deep within the building. Around the table sat generals, designers, and doctrine officers, men who had shaped Soviet air power for decades. Sokolov stood at attention. "Begin," a Generalleutnant said. Sokolov laid out the facts, dates, altitudes, aircraft types. He spoke of repeated engagements, different pilots, varying conditions. He described how the MiG-29 consistently sought the turning fight and how the F-16 consistently denied it. "The American pilots," Sokolov said, choosing his words carefully, "do not prioritize positional dominance. They prioritize energy and decision-making." One general frowned. "Our aircraft is superior in close combat." "Yes," Sokolov replied, "but close combat only occurs if the enemy agrees to stay." Silence settled over the room. A design bureau representative leaned forward. "Are you suggesting the MiG-29 is flawed?" "No," Sokolov said. "I am suggesting it is predictable." That word landed heavily. The replay footage filled the screen. Time slowed as the F-16 disengaged, re-engaged, disengaged again. To Soviet eyes, it looked indecisive, almost cowardly. Yet every maneuver ended with the MiG disadvantaged. "The Americans fight like hunters," Sokolov said. "They wound, withdraw, and strike again when the moment is right." A doctrine officer bristled. "This contradicts everything we teach." "Yes," Sokolov said quietly, "that is why it works." The discussion grew tense. Some argued the MiG needed more thrust, more missiles, more authority at high angles of attack. Others insisted the pilots simply needed stricter discipline. But one truth hung unspoken in the room. The problem could not be solved by metal alone. Late in the meeting, a senior marshal finally spoke. "What you are describing is not an aircraft advantage. It is a cultural one." Heads turned. "The Americans trust their pilots," the marshal continued. "We trust our plans." No one disagreed. Thousands of kilometers away, at a NATO base, Mercer packed his gear. The exercise was over. The Cold War continued.
To him, the sky had returned to normal: training flights, briefings, repetition. He would never know the weight his actions now carried in Moscow. In the weeks that followed, quiet changes began. Training syllabi were revised. Discussions emerged about giving pilots more autonomy. Engineers debated avionics, cockpit ergonomics, information flow. But change in the Soviet system was slow. Hierarchies resisted. Doctrine defended itself. By the time the Berlin Wall fell, those questions would remain unresolved. Yet, on that September morning in 1988, something irreversible had happened. For the first time, Soviet advisors had confronted a future where victory was not guaranteed by performance charts or superior turns. It would be decided by who could adapt faster in the chaos of real combat. And in the skies above Germany, the F-16 had delivered that message with brutal clarity. But in the minds of those who had watched the engagements unfold, the war in the air had already tilted. Colonel Viktor Sokolov stood once more at a window in Moscow, looking out over a city that had begun to feel the strain of an ending era. He thought back to the Fulda Gap, to the way the American jets had slipped and in out of danger like living things. For the first time in his career, he wondered if the future of air combat no longer belonged to the machine, but to the pilot inside it. Across the Atlantic, Captain Daniel Mercer continued to fly. New exercises, new opponents, the same lessons repeated until they became instinct. He never knew the names of the men in Moscow who studied his flight data, just as they never knew his, yet they were bound by the same truth. Air combat was no longer about forcing the enemy into submission. It was about denying him certainty. The MiG-29 had been built to win a specific kind of fight. The F-16 had been built to avoid it. In that difference lay the outcome not just of an exercise, but of an era. Years later, analysts would look back on encounters like this and understand them as turning points, not because of missiles fired or aircraft lost, but because assumptions had been exposed and broken. The Soviet advisors had believed mastery came from control. The Americans had demonstrated that mastery could come from letting go. High above Germany on a clear September morning, that lesson had been written in contrails and silence. And by the time the Cold War ended, the sky had already chosen its winner.